The date was August 20th, 1943, and Charles Sorensen stood on the observation platform overlooking the main assembly line at Willow Run, watching something that defied every principle of aviation manufacturing he'd been taught. A complete B-24 Liberator bomber, 110 feet long, 18 feet high, weighing 36,000 pounds empty, rolled off the production line. 63 minutes later, another one emerged, then another, and another. Every single hour, a 4-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of explosives across the Atlantic was being completed and towed out to the runway. The sound was overwhelming. The pneumatic rivet guns firing in rhythmic bursts, the roar of radial engines being test-fired, the metallic screech of aluminum being shaped into wings. But what made Sorensen's eyes water wasn't the noise or even the industrial ballet happening below him. It was the knowledge that 18 months earlier, this had been farmland. This is the story of how Henry Ford's engineers built the largest factory under one roof in human history, how they convinced the world's most conservative aviation industry to abandon everything it knew about building airplanes, and how an automobile assembly line became the weapon that helped win World War II. But it's also the story of what happens when you push industrial systems beyond what anyone thought possible, and the hidden costs of that achievement. The impossible request. In January 1941, President Roosevelt stood before Congress and announced his vision for American industrial mobilization. The United States would become the great arsenal of democracy. The numbers he cited seemed fantastical: 50,000 aircraft per year. America's entire aviation industry had built barely 6,000 planes in 1940. The bottleneck was obvious to anyone who understood aircraft manufacturing. Unlike automobiles, planes weren't mass-produced. They were handcrafted by skilled artisans in small batches. At Consolidated Aircraft's San Diego facility, building a single B-24 Liberator bomber took approximately 35,000 man-hours. Craftsmen hand-fitted each aluminum panel, custom-drilled every rivet hole, and individually wired each instrument. No two planes were exactly alike. The B-24 was America's heavy bomber of choice for the European theater. It could fly further than the B-17 Flying Fortress, carry more bombs, and was theoretically easier to produce because it used simpler construction techniques. But easier was relative. The plane still required 1,550,000 separate parts, 360,000 rivets, 13,500 bolts, and hundreds of subsystems that all had to work in harmony at 28,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures while being shot at by German fighters. Consolidated Aircraft could build about one B-24 per day at full capacity. The Army Air Forces had calculated they would need at least 500 bombers per month just to sustain operations in Europe. That number would soon prove to be a dramatic underestimate. Multiple contractors were brought in: Douglas Aircraft in Tulsa, North American Aviation in Dallas. But even with multiple factories running at full capacity, production projections fell painfully short of operational requirements. Someone in the War Production Board had a radical idea: ask Ford. Henry Ford was 77 years old in 1941, increasingly eccentric and harboring deeply isolationist views about America's involvement in European conflicts. But his company had perfected something no aviation manufacturer possessed: the moving assembly line. Ford's River Rouge complex in Dearborn could produce a complete automobile every 49 seconds. Raw materials entered one end, iron ore, coal, sand, and finished cars drove out the other. The question was whether those principles could be applied to something as complex as a 4-engine bomber. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, was called to Washington to meet with military planners. They showed him drawings of the B-24, walked him through the specifications, and asked if Ford could build them. Sorensen studied the blueprints for 3 days straight. Then he told them something that made the aviation experts in the room want to laugh him out of the building. Ford could build one B-24 per hour. Not per day, not per week, one per hour, every hour, around the clock. Sorensen's calculations suggested that with proper factory layout and true assembly line techniques, they could produce 500 bombers per month from a single facility. The aviation industry's response ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. One consolidated aircraft engineer was quoted saying, "These automen don't understand. Airplanes aren't cars with wings." But Sorensen understood something the aviation industry didn't. The problem wasn't the complexity of the B-24. The problem was the manufacturing philosophy. Aircraft makers were trying to build planes the way medieval craftsmen built cathedrals, one at a time, by hand, with each being unique. Ford would build them the way you build a city, with standardization, interchangeable parts, and ruthless efficiency. The government gave Ford the contract. Now they had to actually do it. Building the unbuildable. Sorensen needed a facility unlike anything that had ever been constructed. The B-24 had a 110-foot wingspan. To build it on an assembly line, you needed a building long enough for multiple aircraft to be in process simultaneously, wide enough to accommodate the wings, and tall enough for the vertical stabilizers. And you needed it immediately. War production couldn't wait for architectural perfection. The site chosen was a stretch of farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan, alongside Willow Run Creek. It was flat, had good rail access, and was close enough to Ford's existing Detroit facilities to share workforce and infrastructure. In March 1941, construction crews broke ground on what would become the most ambitious industrial building project of the era. The main assembly building would be L-shaped, with the long legs stretching 3,200 feet, more than half a mile, and 1,280 feet across. Under one roof, it contained 3.5 million square feet of floor space. To put that in perspective, you could fit the Pentagon inside Willow Run with room left over. The roof alone required 27 acres of material. But the true engineering challenge wasn't the size, it was what would happen inside. Sorensen's team had to completely reimagine how a bomber was constructed. In traditional aircraft manufacturing, the plane stayed in one place while teams of workers moved around it, installing systems sequentially. Ford would flip that paradigm entirely. The plane would move continuously through the factory, while specialized workstations performed specific tasks. It was the River Rouge plant multiplied in scale and complexity. The first problem was the wings. The B-24's wings were massive structures, 110 feet of stressed aluminum skin over internal spars and ribs. At Consolidated, wings were built on huge jigs where workers hand-assembled each component. Ford's solution was to build the wings upside down on a moving fixture, with workers stationed along the line performing specific repetitive tasks. One team installed leading-edge ribs, the next team added fuel tank mounts, another team installed hydraulic lines, and so on. The wing would be completed as it moved through the station, then flipped right side up and mated to the fuselage. This required solving thousands of small problems. How do you flip a 110-foot wing weighing several thousand pounds without damaging it? Ford's engineers designed specialized rotating fixtures mounted on rails. How do you ensure every rivet hole lines up perfectly when you're working on an assembly line? They created master jigs and templates that were duplicated across stations. How do you train workers to perform precision aircraft assembly when most of them had never seen an airplane up close? They broke every task down into repetitive motions that could be mastered in hours rather than months. The fuselage presented different challenges. It was built in 5 major sections: nose, forward fuselage, center fuselage, aft fuselage, and tail. Each section was assembled on its own subline, then brought together on the main line for joining.
The center section was particularly complex because it had to integrate the wing attachment points, the bomb bay, the main landing gear, and dozens of structural elements, all within precise tolerances.
Ford's engineers designed specialized tooling that held each section rigid while workers installed components. They created guide pins and alignment fixtures that ensured sections would mate perfectly every time. They calculated the exact sequence of operations so that workers never had to reach awkwardly or wait for access to a particular area. Every motion was studied, timed, and optimized.
By September 1942, the building was complete and equipment was being installed. By December, the first experimental B-24 began its journey down the line. It took 6 weeks to complete, nowhere near the 1 per hour target, but it proved the concept worked. More importantly, it identified the bottlenecks that would need to be eliminated.
The learning curve. The first 6 months of production were a disaster by any conventional measure. Planes came off the line with missing parts, incorrectly installed systems, and failures in quality control that would have been caught immediately in traditional manufacturing. In January 1943, Willow Run produced just 31 bombers. The aviation industry's skeptics felt vindicated. Automen didn't understand airplanes after all.
But something interesting was happening if you looked beneath the surface chaos. Production was increasing exponentially, not linearly. In February, they built 75 planes. In March, 104. Each month brought not just more aircraft, but refinements to the process itself. Ford had essentially built the factory as a prototype. They were learning how to manufacture bombers by manufacturing bombers. The problems they encountered were often absurdly specific. The electrical wiring harnesses, for example, contained thousands of individual wires that had to be routed through the airframe. In traditional construction, skilled electricians would run wires individually, securing them as they went. On an assembly line, this created chaos. Workers got in each other's way, wires were routed incorrectly, and inspections took forever. Inspection Ford's solution was to pre-build entire wiring harnesses off the line using wooden mock-ups of the aircraft interior. Every wire was cut to exact length, fitted with proper connectors, and bundled into a complete harness that could be installed in minutes rather than days. This required building full-scale wooden replicas of each section of the aircraft, essentially building shadow factories within the factory to manufacture sub-assemblies, but this took forever. The hydraulic system presented similar challenges. The B-24's hydraulics controlled everything from landing gear to bomb bay doors to gun turrets. Miles of hydraulic lines snaked through the aircraft, connected by hundreds of fittings. Leaks were common in traditional assembly and required hours of debugging. Ford created pre-tested hydraulic modules that were pressure-checked before installation. If a module leaked during final inspection, the entire unit could be swapped out in 30 minutes rather than tearing apart systems to find the failure point. The most visible bottleneck was the workforce. Willow Run eventually employed over 42,000 people working around the clock in 2 shifts. Most had never built anything more complex than an automobile. Many had never held a factory job at all. This was 1943, and the male workforce was being drafted into military service at staggering rates. Women filled the gap. By mid-1943, 40% of Willow Run's workforce was female. Rose Monroe became the face of this transformation. She was a 24-year-old widow from Kentucky who had moved to Michigan for work after her husband died. At Willow Run, she worked as a riveter, driving pneumatic rivets into aluminum wing sections for 9 hours a day. When the government needed a symbol for women in war production, they filmed Rose at her station, and she became the real-world Rosie the Riveter. But the training challenge went beyond gender. You had farm boys from rural Michigan working alongside auto workers from Detroit alongside women who had been housewives 6 months earlier. Ford's solution was to break every job into its smallest possible component and train workers on one specific task until they could perform it perfectly. A worker might spend 8 hours a day installing a particular bracket or drilling a specific set of holes. It was monotonous, exhausting work, but it meant someone with minimal experience could contribute to building the world's most complex aircraft. The quality control problems slowly resolved themselves through iteration. Ford implemented inspection stations every few hundred feet along the assembly line. Rather than waiting until the end to find problems, defects were caught and corrected immediately. They created a feedback system where inspectors could communicate directly with specific workstations about recurring issues. Within weeks, error rates for particular operations would drop dramatically. By May 1943, Willow Run was producing 190 bombers per month. By August, they hit 365, more than one per day on average. But the daily numbers concealed the real achievement. Peak hourly production had reached the target. During optimal shifts with experienced crews, a complete B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The machine at full power. Once Willow Run reached full production capacity in late 1943, it became something unprecedented in human industrial history, a factory that could not stop. The economics and logistics of bomber production at scale meant that any interruption cascaded into catastrophic delays. Tens of thousands of workers were synchronized like a clockwork mechanism. Suppliers were delivering materials on precise schedules, and the military was planning combat operations around projected delivery numbers. The flow of materials into Willow Run was staggering. Every day, 1,300 freight cars arrived carrying aluminum sheet, steel tubing, rubber, glass, electronics, engines, and thousands of other components. The aluminum alone was telling. By 1944, Willow Run was consuming 40% of all aluminum production in the United States. Raw aluminum arrived at one end of the building and emerged 40 hours later as part of a finished bomber. The engines were the most complex components Ford didn't manufacture themselves. Each B-24 required 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 radial engines, massive 14-cylinder power plants producing 1,200 horsepower each. These arrived from Pratt & Whitney's plants already assembled and tested. On the Willow Run line, teams of mechanics would install all 4 engines on a single aircraft in less than 3 hours using specialized hoists and fixtures that positioned engines with millimeter precision. The rhythm of production was hypnotic if you watched from the observation platform. At the beginning of the line, you saw skeletal frames, just the basic aluminum skeleton of the fuselage. 30 feet down the line, the outer skin was being riveted on. 60 feet further, the wings were being attached. As the aircraft moved forward, it gradually transformed from framework to finished bomber. By the time it reached the end of the 3,200-foot building, it was complete except for final testing and paint. Test pilots would taxi each completed bomber directly from the assembly building to the adjacent runway, one of the longest private runways in America, built specifically for Willow Run. They would conduct a test flight lasting 30 to 45 minutes, checking engine performance, flight controls, and systems integration. If everything checked out, the plane would land, receive its military markings, and be flown to modification centers where specialized equipment was installed based on its intended mission. Between September 1943 and May 1945, Willow Run produced 8,685 B-24 Liberators. During peak production in 1944, the factory delivered 432 bombers in a single month, roughly 14 per day. To put this in perspective, this single factory produced more 4-engine bombers than the entire Japanese aircraft industry built of all types during the entire war. The human cost of this achievement deserves attention. Workers at Willow Run worked 6 days a week, 9-hour shifts. The noise level in the factory was dangerous, sustained above 100 decibels in many areas, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage. Protective equipment was minimal by modern standards. Accidents were common. The repetitive motion injuries alone affected thousands of workers. The psychological toll of performing the same physical task thousands of times per week, month after month, was something that industrial psychology was only beginning to understand. The social disruption around Willow Run was equally significant. Ypsilanti's population exploded as workers flooded in from across the country. Housing was catastrophically insufficient. The government built temporary housing projects, basic wooden barrack-style buildings with minimal amenities, that filled immediately. Workers lived in their cars, in trailers, in makeshift tent cities. Local infrastructure collapsed under the strain. Sewage systems were overwhelmed. Schools had triple the students they were designed for. The social fabric of rural Michigan communities was torn apart by the sudden urbanization. Yet nobody stopped. The factory couldn't stop. Every bomber that rolled off the Willow Run line was earmarked for a specific bomb group in Europe or the Pacific. Operational planners had built missions around projected aircraft availability. Stop the line, and you weren't just delaying production. You were potentially altering the outcome of campaigns happening half a world away. The strategic impact. The B-24 liberators from Willow Run entered service in every theater of World War II, but their greatest concentration was in the European strategic bombing campaign. By 1944, the 8th Air Force in England was launching raids with over 1,000 heavy bombers striking targets across Germany. A substantial percentage of those bombers came from Willow Run. The strategic calculus of bomber production is grimly simple. You need enough aircraft to maintain operational strength despite losses. In 1943 and early 1944, bomber losses over Germany were catastrophic. Some missions saw 10% losses, occasionally spiking to 20% or higher. The mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943 lost 60 B-17s out of 291 aircraft, a 20.6% loss rate that was unsustainable. The 8th Air Force calculated they needed approximately 150 heavy bombers per month just to replace combat losses. Willow Run's production meant the United States could absorb those losses and still increase operational strength. By D-Day in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had over 2,000 heavy bombers operational. That numerical superiority, more than any technical innovation or tactical brilliance, enabled the sustained bombing campaign that systematically destroyed Germany's oil refineries, transportation networks, and industrial capacity. There's a direct correlation between Willow Run hitting full production and the Allies achieving air superiority over Europe. When you can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them, you win through attrition. It's not glorious, it's not elegant, but it's mathematically inevitable. Ford's factory was doing to the Luftwaffe what Grant had done to Lee, trading casualties knowing you had deeper reserves. The B-24s also proved crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic. Their long range made them ideal submarine hunters. Liberators equipped with radar could patrol vast stretches of ocean, and their production numbers meant enough aircraft could be spared from strategic bombing missions to form dedicated anti-submarine squadrons. U-boat losses spiked in 1943 and 1944, and while convoy tactics and code breaking contributed significantly, simple aircraft availability was essential. You can't patrol the entire Atlantic with 36 bombers. You need hundreds. In the Pacific, B-24s from Willow Run bombed Japanese oil refineries in Borneo, struck shipping in the South China Sea, and supported MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. The sheer number of available aircraft meant operational commanders could take risks they otherwise couldn't. If losing 6 bombers on a particular mission was acceptable because you had 150 more in reserve, you approved missions that would be suicide runs with limited inventory. The hidden costs. When the war ended in August 1945, Willow Run stopped producing B-24s within days. The last bomber rolled off the line on June 28, 1945. Orders were canceled, contracts terminated, and 42,000 workers received termination notices. The sudden shutdown created economic chaos in southeastern Michigan. Communities that had swollen to accommodate war workers collapsed. The temporary housing projects became ghost towns. Workers who had migrated to Michigan for jobs found themselves stranded without employment or resources to relocate. The factory itself became a white elephant. It was too large, too specialized, and too expensive to repurpose for civilian manufacturing. Ford sold it to the government for a fraction of construction costs. For years, it sat largely vacant, occasionally used for storage or small-scale manufacturing. The building that had represented the peak of American industrial capability became a monument to obsolescence. The human toll extended beyond unemployment. Thousands of Willow Run workers suffered permanent hearing loss from years of exposure to industrial noise. Repetitive stress injuries crippled workers who had performed the same motions tens of thousands of times. The psychological impact of suddenly transitioning from essential war work to unemployed civilian was devastating for many workers who had defined themselves by their contribution to the war effort. The communities that had been transformed by Willow Run never fully recovered their pre-war character. Ypsilanti had been a small college town of 12,000 people in 1940. By 1943, the area's population exceeded 80,000. The social infrastructure built for a small town couldn't support an industrial city. When the factory closed, it left behind urban problems without urban resources to address them. There's also a darker question about what Willow Run represented strategically. The factory was a triumph of industrial organization, but it was also a machine optimized for producing tools of destruction at unprecedented scale. Every engineering achievement, every efficiency gain, every innovation in manufacturing technique had a single purpose: to build more bombers faster so they could drop more bombs on more targets. By 1945, American industry had become horrifyingly efficient at producing weapons. The industrial capacity that built 8,685 bombers at Willow Run also built 50,000 other aircraft that year, 95,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 17 million rifles, and the machinery of total war on a scale never before witnessed. And because America had that capacity, it used it. The strategic bombing campaign killed an estimated 350,000 to 500,000 German civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more people in a single night than died in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. None of this is to argue that America shouldn't have fought World War II or that the industrial mobilization was wrong. But it's worth acknowledging that Willow Run's achievement had costs, human costs, social costs, and moral costs, that don't appear in production statistics or celebration of industrial prowess. The legacy. Willow Run's techniques influenced American manufacturing for decades. The principles of line production, standardization, and quality control integration became standard practice across industries. Post-war automobile plants, appliance manufacturers, and eventually electronics production all borrowed from the lessons learned building bombers in Michigan. The workforce transformations proved even more lasting. The women who worked at Willow Run didn't all return to pre-war domestic roles. Many continued in manufacturing jobs, though they faced systematic discrimination and wage inequality. The precedent of women in industrial work had been established, and while progress was slow, it was irreversible. The building itself had a strange afterlife. In the 1950s, it was used to build automobiles, Kaiser Frazer cars, then General Motors transmissions. Parts of it were demolished over the decades. By the 2000s, only a small section remained, and it was slated for complete demolition. A preservation effort saved a portion of the original building, which now houses the Yankee Air Museum, a repository of aviation history that includes extensive exhibits on Willow Run itself. In 2010, a group of veterans who had flown B-24s returned to Willow Run for a reunion. These were men in their 80s and 90s, many of whom had flown combat missions over Germany 70 years earlier. They walked through the remains of the factory that had built their aircraft. One veteran was quoted as saying, "We knew these planes were being built somewhere, but we never imagined a place like this." It's overwhelming. That sense of being overwhelmed is perhaps the appropriate response to Willow Run. It was overwhelming in its scale, overwhelming in its ambition, and overwhelming in its impact. It represented industrial capitalism operating at maximum efficiency for a singular purpose. Whether that's inspiring or terrifying probably depends on your perspective and what you believe about human nature, warfare, and the cost we're willing to pay for survival. What it means today? We live in an era where manufacturing has largely moved overseas, where American industrial capacity is a shadow of its World War II peak, and where the idea of building anything at the scale of Willow Run seems like science fiction. The lessons of Willow Run feel simultaneously relevant and impossible to apply. The relevance is obvious. When faced with existential crisis, industrial capacity matters enormously. The ability to produce essential goods at scale, whether that's bombers, vaccines, microchips, or energy infrastructure, can determine national survival. The pandemic exposed how vulnerable modern supply chains are to disruption and how quickly shortages cascade into crisis. Willow Run demonstrated that rapid scaling is possible when there's sufficient political will and resources. From farmland to peak production took less than 3 years. That seems impossibly fast today when infrastructure projects take a decade to approve, Environmental reviews extend for years, and NIMBYism blocks development at every turn. But the impossibility is equally obvious. Willow Run was built under wartime emergency powers with essentially unlimited funding, no regulatory constraints, and a social consensus that sacrifices were necessary for survival. Workers accepted conditions that would trigger immediate strikes today. Communities accepted disruption that would generate years of lawsuits now. The environmental impact, waste disposal, air pollution, resource extraction, would be completely unacceptable by modern standards. There's also the uncomfortable question of whether we'd want to replicate Willow Run even if we could. It represented a totalizing vision of industrial organization where human workers were optimized like machine components. The social and personal costs were real, even if they were accepted as necessary at the time. Any future mobilization of industrial capacity at similar scale would need to be fundamentally different in how it treats workers, communities, and environmental impact. Yet standing in what remains of Willow Run today, looking at the massive steel trusses and imagining bombers rolling off the line every 63 minutes, it's impossible not to feel a strange mix of awe and unease. Awe at what humans can accomplish when organized toward a common purpose. Unease at how that same organizational capacity can be turned toward destruction. Charles Sorensen, the man who made it all possible, wrote in his autobiography, "Willow Run was more than a factory. It was proof that free people with clear purpose could outproduce any totalitarian system." That was the real victory. Maybe he was right. Or maybe the real lesson is simpler and darker. When survival is at stake, humans will build anything, sacrifice anything, and pay any cost. And will be terrifyingly efficient at it. The bombers kept rolling off the line, one every 63 minutes, until the war was won and they weren't needed anymore. Then they stopped, and we've been trying to understand what that achievement meant ever since.